Rust and ozone. The smell hit him before anything else did, hot metal cooling too fast, and under it, the wet copper stink of blood that wasn't entirely his own. Somewhere above the tree line, something with wings the size of transport shuttles screamed once and went quiet, and the quiet was worse than the scream. Elias Vance lay on his back in a crater of his own making, staring up through a canopy of black, oil-slicked leaves at a sky the color of a dying bruise, and he thought, with the strange calm that only comes after your body has decided panic is a luxury it can't afford. Well, this is new. His left arm didn't work. His ribs told him, in no uncertain terms, that at least 2 of them had relocated. And 40 kilometers up, past the atmosphere, past the debris field that used to be an escort cruiser, a ship was already breaking orbit without him. He didn't blame her. Not yet. That would come later, in the long, cold nights, when blame was the only fuel he had left to keep himself moving. Right now, there was only the crater, and the leaves, and the distant sound of something enormous deciding whether he was worth the trouble of eating. He started counting his fingers. All 10, more or less, that was a start. The rain came next. If it was rain, thick, oily drops that hissed faintly where they landed on the still warm hull fragments scattered across the crater, and left small dark scorch marks on the leaves they touched. He didn't move fast enough to avoid it entirely, and where it caught the exposed skin of his neck it burned. A slow chemical sting that told him, with brutal clarity, that lying still and thinking about his hands was a luxury this planet was not going to keep extending him. Somewhere behind the tree line, low and rhythmic, something exhaled a sound like a bellows the size of a shuttle bay, and the ground under his ruined arm trembled very slightly with each footfall. He had exactly 1 working arm, 1 working plan, and considerably less time than he wanted to accept, and so he did the only thing a man in his position could reasonably do. He started to crawl. The mechanic nobody wanted. 3 months earlier, nobody on the Dominion flagship Ashen verdict would have looked twice at Elias Vance. That was rather the point. He wore a jumpsuit 2 sizes too big, permanently the color of old engine grease no matter how many times it went through the sonic wash, and he kept a socket wrench tucked into his belt the way other men kept sidearms. His knuckles were a roadmap of old burns. He had a habit of talking to machinery under his breath, the way some men talked to dogs, and a habit of going quiet around people that made officers assume he was slow, when in fact he simply preferred to be right the first time he opened his mouth. He had been a fleet engineer once, 3rd class, assigned to the reactor decks of a proper cruiser. Then a coolant manifold had started reading wrong 3 hours before a scheduled jump, and his superior officer, a man who outranked him by 2 grades and understanding of thermodynamics by considerably less, had ordered the jump anyway. Vance had refused to authorize the sequence. He'd been right. The manifold would have ruptured mid-jump and turned 400 people into vapor. He'd also been insubordinate, and insubordinate men do not get commendations, they get reassigned to whatever ship will have them, doing whatever job nobody wants. That job, on the Ashen verdict, was keeping a decorative honor guard transport running for a princess who had never once learned his name. Her Highness boards the wrench deck. Princess Ilyra Caldrath came down to the maintenance deck exactly once, and it was not a friendly visit. She was tall in the way her whole species was tall, 2 meters of layered gray-green plating over dense, corded muscle, eyes the flat gold of a predator that has never needed to blink first. She moved like the deck belonged to her, because it did, and she looked at the assembled crew the way a woman might look at furniture that had been rearranged without her permission. "Which of you is responsible for the delay in my personal shuttle's departure clearance?" she said. It wasn't a question. Her people didn't do questions, not really. Everything came out flat and precise. No contractions, no slang, like she was reading from a report even in casual speech. Vance stepped forward because it was his fault, technically, in the sense that he had found a fatigue crack in a support strut and refused to sign off until it was replaced. "That be me, ma'am. Strut's compromised. I can have it swapped in 6 hours." She looked at him the way you'd look at a stain on an otherwise clean floor. "You are frail," she said, not unkindly, simply as observation. "Your species tires walking up an incline. It does not surprise me that your work moves at the same pace. 6 hours, for metal." 6 hours so the shuttle doesn't come apart at altitude, he said. "Ma'am. Humans are." given passage on Dominion vessels as a courtesy to a species that cannot yet defend its own borders, she added, before he could answer, apparently unwilling to let the moment pass without finishing the thought. It would serve you well to remember that a courtesy extended can be withdrawn. She glanced once at the crew behind him, none of whom met her eyes, and back at Vance, who had not looked away. You do not seem afraid of me, mechanic. Wasn't planning on being, he said. Wouldn't fix the strut any faster if I was. Something flickered behind the flat gold of her eyes, there and gone before he could name it. Not quite respect, not yet, but something closer to mild, genuine surprise, the reaction of a woman used to fear preceding every conversation she had. She held his eyes for a moment longer than she needed to, gold and flat and utterly without curiosity, and then turned and left, and that was, as far as either of them was concerned, the entirety of their relationship. He fixed the strut in 5 hours and 40 minutes out of spite. She never knew or asked or cared. The order that could not be refused. The order came down 11 weeks later, garbled through 6 layers of command, the way bad orders always traveled fastest. A diplomatic escort had gone wrong over a system nobody important cared about, and the princess's transport had taken fire covering a retreat that was, depending on who you asked, either heroic or catastrophically mismanaged. The transport limped toward the nearest rock with a breathable atmosphere, trailing atmosphere of its own through a hull breach that ran the length of 3 decks. Vance was the engineer on duty. He was the one who went into the breach section in a suit 2 sizes too small, because the tech who should have gone had frozen at the sight of vacuum on the other side of a bulkhead, and somebody had to reroute power before the whole ship lost attitude control on the way down. The breach itself was a screaming mess of torn alloy and arcing conduit, air shrieking out through a gap he could have put both fists through, and he worked with his hands going numb from cold and decompression alike, splicing 3 severed power runs by feel because his helmet lamp had died on entry and there was no time to swap it. He got it done. He also got thrown 40 meters when a secondary explosion blew the section he was standing in, his suit's integrity alarm screaming in his ear the whole way down a corridor that had, moments before, been a wall, and by the time anyone thought to look for him, the transport was already committed to its landing trajectory. And the landing trajectory did not include a stop to search for one missing mechanic in a debris field the size of a small moon's worth of wreckage. The planet below had a name in the Dominion registry, a string of numbers nobody bothered pronouncing. The survivors called it what it was, a Deathworld. Gravity a shade over standard, atmosphere thick with spores that ate through unsealed rubber in a day, and an ecosystem that had apparently spent several 100 million years perfecting new and creative ways to kill anything that landed on it. The princess, from the survivors' shuttle, watched the crater where the wreckage had come down and made the call that any commander in her position would have made. There was no time. There were no resources. The mission was to get her remaining people off that rock before the local wildlife or the local weather finished the job the enemy had started. "Leave him," she said, and her voice did not shake because her voice never did. "We cannot spend more lives confirming one is already lost." She was not wrong by any calculation that mattered to a princess responsible for 11 other lives. She was also not right because Elias Vance was not, in fact, dead. First night on Kharun. He woke up in the crater somewhere around what his internal clock insisted was evening, though the sky here didn't seem to agree on what evening meant. His suit had cracked along the left forearm, and something in the local air had already started working on the seal, a slow chemical hiss he could hear if he held still enough. He held still. He listened to his own ribs grinding when he breathed and decided that moving was, on balance, less bad than dying of infection from a cracked suit. He got the suit off in stages, wincing, using his good arm to peel plating away from the bad one, and found that his forearm had a compound fracture, the bone visibly wrong under skin gone purple-black with bruising. He had a field kit. Field kits are not designed for compound fractures. They are designed for scrapes and the vague hope that the wearer survives long enough to reach a real medic. He used it anyway. He splinted the arm with 2 struts pried from his own ruined suit and cinched the makeshift brace tight enough to make himself gray and lightheaded. And he did it without screaming, because screaming out here was an invitation. Something moved in the tree line. Big. He couldn't see it, not clearly, just a shifting of shadow denser than the shadows around it, and a smell like wet stone and old meat. He didn't move. Humans, he thought, with the distant, floating clarity of a man in significant shock, are apparently very good at holding still when it matters. Funny thing to learn about yourself 40 kilometers from the nearest human being. The shadow passed. He allowed himself exactly one shuddering breath, and then he started dragging himself, one-armed, toward the wreckage of the transport, because wreckage meant tools, and tools were the only thing on this planet that had ever, in his whole life, reliably not tried to kill him. Learning to sweat like a weapon. The wreck gave him 3 things worth having: a half-collapsed cargo module that could be sealed against the weather, a stripped-down atmospheric processor he could rebuild with his good hand and his teeth, and 3 days in, a fever that told him the compound fracture had gone bad despite his best efforts. He remembered in the fog of that fever a lecture from a training officer years back about why humans made decent infantry on hot worlds when other species didn't. Not strength, not speed, sweat. His body could shed heat through evaporative cooling in a way that let him keep working, keep moving, long after a Caldrath's dense plating would have them collapsed and cooking in their own biology. It felt like a cruel joke to remember it now, shivering and burning at once, but he used it. He forced himself to move in the worst heat of the day, when the local fauna, all thick-hided and heavily insulated, retreated into shade to keep from overheating. He worked while they slept off the sun. It cost him, his fever spiked, his vision swam, he vomited more than once from the heat alone. But every day he was the only thing moving on that stretch of ground, and every day that meant one more day of not being found by something with teeth. The heat itself was almost a physical presence during those working hours. A weight pressing down through the canopy that made the local fauna retreat, drooling and sluggish, into whatever shade they could find, their thick insulating hides turning against them the moment the temperature climbed past what their biology could shed efficiently. Vance sweated through 3 shirts a day and drank water until his stomach ached, and it was, without question, miserable. But misery, he reminded himself through gritted teeth more than once, was a currency he could afford to spend on this planet in a way broken bones and empty stomachs were not. By the end of the first week, the processor was breathing clean air into his shelter. By the end of the second, the fever had broken, leaving him 15 pounds lighter, and with a permanent low ache in the arm that had healed, he suspected, more crooked than a proper medic would have allowed. He was, by any reasonable accounting, still alive. He tried not to think too hard about what that meant, long-term, on a rock that ate ships for a hobby. The hunt that never ends. Food ran out faster than he expected. The transport stores had been meant to feed 12 people for a week, not one person indefinitely, and most of it had been destroyed in the crash anyway. What was left, he rationed until rationing stopped being enough, and then he did the thing every survival manual he'd ever half-read told him not to do alone, injured, on a planet he didn't understand. He went hunting. Not hunting like the vids showed it, no clean shot, no single dramatic kill. He'd found, on the second week, a herd animal the locals. He'd started calling them locals. Like this was a town he'd moved to that moved in loose groups across the scrubland north of the crash site, heavily muscled things with hide like woven cable and a startle response that could outrun him in a dead sprint for the first 400 meters. He couldn't outrun them. Nothing on 2 legs on this planet, he suspected, could outrun much of anything. But he could outlast them. He picked one, a big male with a limp that told him it was already carrying an old injury, and he simply started walking after it. Not running. Walking, steady, relentless, all through the worst heat of the day when the animal wanted to stop and rest and couldn't, not with something behind it that refused to give up the chase. Every time it broke into a run to put distance between them, it spent heat it couldn't shed fast enough in its own thick hide, and every time it slowed to cool down, he closed the gap again. Hour 4, it was stumbling. Hour 6, it went down in the scrub, sides heaving, overheated, and finally still enough for him to close the distance with a length of sharpened strut in his one good hand. He was sick after. Not from the kill, from the understanding, settling into him with the particular weight of a fact that changes how you see yourself, that his body was built for exactly this, not to overpower, to outlast, Every single thing on this planet that could kill him quickly would eventually run out of ways to keep killing him slowly, and he apparently never would. Scrap becomes salvation. Winter came, if winter was even the word for it, 6 weeks after the crash. The days shortened and the wind off the eastern ridge started carrying ice crystals that cut exposed skin like the edge of a blade. And Vance realized, with the flat clarity of a man doing math he didn't want to do, that his shelter was not going to keep him alive through it. So he did what he had always done on every ship he'd ever served on when the official solution wasn't good enough. He built something better out of the wrong parts. The transport's ruined hull plating became walls, hauled sheet by sheet across 2 kilometers of broken ground with a drag harness he rigged from cargo webbing. The processor's waste heat, which had been venting uselessly into the sky, got rerouted through a manifold he salvaged from the wreck's cooling system, into a network of scavenged piping that ran under a floor of packed earth and scrap, turning his shelter into something with actual, blessed radiant heat. He rigged a rainwater collector from a curved piece of hull that had, in its former life, been part of a decorative viewport. He built a forge, of all things, from the transport's old reactor housing, because he needed to reshape metal, and metal does not reshape itself politely. None of it worked the first time. The heating manifold blew a seal and nearly gassed him with coolant fumes in his sleep. The forge cracked its first firing and threw slag across his workspace, one shard of which put a scar through his eyebrow he'd carry the rest of his life. He fixed each failure, learned from it, tried again, because that was the only method he had ever really trusted. Not brilliance, not inspiration, just the stubborn refusal to accept that a problem was unsolvable simply because it had beaten him once. By midwinter, he had a shelter that could keep a man alive through weather that killed the local fauna in the open. He had also, though he didn't fully register it yet, stopped thinking of himself as a castaway waiting for rescue, and started thinking of himself as someone who lived here. Teeth made of scrap. The pack that finally forced his hand came through in the 4th month. A loose family group of low, heavy-shouldered hunters that moved on all fours and hunted the way wolves once had on a planet he was starting to remember only in fragments. Patient, coordinated, willing to test a target for weaknesses before committing. They tested him twice before he understood what was happening. The first time, a single scout animal simply watched him from the tree line for the better part of an hour while he worked, close enough to be a threat, too far to charge before he could reach the forge. The second time, 3 days later, 2 of them worked the edges of his cleared perimeter at dusk, driving him back toward the shelter with feints he only barely recognized as feints. Testing the ground, testing him, the way a predator tests fencing before deciding whether it's worth the effort to breach. He understood, with the cold clarity of a man who had already been stalked by worse, that a third test was coming, and that the next one would not be a test at all. He built the answer the way he built everything, badly, at first, then less badly, then well enough to work. A ring of sharpened stakes, driven into the earth at the exact angle his hunting had taught him a low, fast predator would need to cross to reach the shelter, angled to catch a charging animal's own momentum against it. A tripline rigged from cargo cable, strung ankle height through the brush at the perimeter's weakest point, tied to a counterweighted section of hull plating he'd rigged to drop with enough force to break bone. A pit, dug over 4 exhausting days with a shovel improvised from a cargo hatch, disguised under a woven lattice of branches and packed soil, deep enough that anything falling into it would find climbing out considerably harder than falling in. The pack came on the 9th night, in the full dark, 4 of them moving in a loose, silent formation he only knew was there because the perimeter alarms he'd rigged from scavenged cable started singing all at once. He came out of the shelter with a torch in one hand and a length of sharpened strut in the other, heart slamming, and watched his own work do exactly what he'd built it to do. The lead animal hit the tripline and took the counterweighted plating full across the shoulder with a crack he felt in his own teeth. A second went down into the pit with a snarl that cut off into a startled, furious yelp, and the last 2, faced with a wall of stakes where open ground should have been, hesitated exactly long enough for fire and noise to convince them the meal wasn't worth the trouble anymore. E didn't come away clean. The animal that hit the tripline wasn't disabled, only staggered, and it came at him anyway on 3 good legs, jaws closing on his forearm before he drove the strut into its flank hard enough to end the argument. He spent that night pulling puncture wounds, closed with the same crude thread he'd used on his own splints. Teeth gritted against pain that made his vision swim, and he spent the following week fighting a fever that tasted, at the back of his throat, uncomfortably like the one that had nearly taken his arm 2 years before. He rebuilt the traps stronger once he'd healed enough to work again. Nothing came through his perimeter again after that, not for the rest of his time on Kharun. Not because the planet had run out of things that wanted to kill him, but because he had finally built something on it that the local wildlife respected more than its own hunger. Broken things that still work. The second winter nearly killed him, not through cold, but through his own carelessness, the particular kind that creeps in once survival starts feeling routine. He was hauling a load of scavenged conduit across the frozen scrubland when the ground gave way beneath him. A burrow collapse, he realized later. Some large denning animal's tunnel network hollowed out under a thin crust of frozen soil, and he went down 8 feet onto packed stone, and something in his left leg made a sound he felt in his teeth before he heard it in his ears. He lay there for 11 minutes by his own count, breathing through the kind of pain that turns the whole world white at the edges, before he accepted that no one was coming to pull him out, and started, very slowly, to climb. The leg was broken below the knee, and this time there was no field kit left to help. He splinted it with conduit and cargo strapping, the same crude engineering that had saved his arm 2 winters back, cinching it tight enough that white spots bloomed across his vision, and he dragged himself the 4 kilometers home on his forearms and 1 good leg. Over frozen ground that tore through his gloves within the first kilometer, and left the skin beneath raw and bleeding by the 3rd, in failing light, while something with a low chuffing call followed him at a distance the entire way. Curious or hungry, he never found out which. He counted his own heartbeats to keep from passing out, and somewhere around heartbeat 4,000, give or take, the wreck silhouette finally rose against the darkening horizon, and he allowed himself, for the first time in hours, to believe he might actually make it inside before the cold or the blood loss decided the matter for him. It took him 3 months to walk again, and he walked wrong for the rest of his life afterward, a slight favor to the left side that never fully went away. He did not think of this as tragedy. By then, he had stopped thinking of pain as something that happened to him and started thinking of it as a toll he paid, over and over, for the privilege of being the one thing on this planet that refused, categorically, to stop functioning. The river that wasn't water. The 3rd winter taught him something the first 2 hadn't, which was that Kharun kept its worst tricks in reserve for whenever he started to feel competent. He found the river by accident, hauling a load of scavenged cable toward a ridge he'd been meaning to survey for months, and for one grateful moment he thought his luck had finally turned. Clean-looking water, wide and slow, exactly what a man who'd been boiling every drop for 2 years wanted to see. He got within 10 meters before the smell reached him, a thin mineral sharpness under the damp, and some old, half-forgotten training manual instinct made him stop and crouch and look closer, instead of simply drinking his fill like a fool. The water wasn't water, not entirely. Some mineral leaching out of the rock upstream had turned the whole river into a slow-moving acid bath, weak enough that it wouldn't kill a man instantly, strong enough that it had stripped the bark clean off every tree unlucky enough to lean too far over its banks. He found the bones to prove it 20 meters downstream, a herd animal's skeleton half dissolved into the bank, hide and muscle long gone, the bones themselves pitted and soft like wet chalk. It would have been easy enough to simply avoid the river forever. It would also have cut off the entire eastern half of his hunting range, the half where the herd animals wintered in numbers his own side of the valley couldn't match, and a man rationing his own body weight in meat every season didn't get to be sentimental about convenient rivers. So he built a bridge. Not out of wood, which the river's spray would have eaten in a season, but out of hull plating he cut and dragged across 2 kilometers of broken ground, welded at the joints in his scavenger's forge, coated on the underside with a resin he cooked, through 3 failed batches and memorable small fire, from the sap of a local tree that turned out, happily, to be immune to the acid the way its neighbors weren't. It took him 6 weeks. He crossed it on the 7th, alone, testing his own weight on a structure that had a fair chance of dropping him into a river that would dissolve him slowly enough to feel every second of it. And it held, and he stood on the far bank in the freezing wind and laughed, for the first time in longer than he could remember. The short, surprised laugh of a man who had just won an argument with an entire planet. The creature with no name. He was not, it turned out, the only intelligent thing stranded on Kharun. He found the Vekthari scout in the 4th year, half buried under a rock slide 2 valleys over, a survivor of some other engagement Vance never got the full story of, from a species he'd only ever seen at a distance across a negotiating table, smaller than the Kaldrath, quicker, built low and wiry with a carapace the deep red of dried blood. The scout was dying slowly, pinned, starving, and utterly, thoroughly an enemy of everything Vance's uniform had once stood for. He dug it out anyway. Took him 6 hours with a lever and his own aching, crooked leg braced against the rock, and by the end of it he had a wild animal's worth of thanks. The scout tried, weakly, to bite him, some instinct that hadn't gotten the memo about gratitude, before exhaustion won and it simply lay still and let him carry it back to the shelter. It did not trust him. It watched him for weeks with the flat, calculating patience of something that expected betrayal at any moment, refused his food until hunger broke the standoff, flinched from his forge, his tools, his crooked, limping walk. But he kept it fed. He kept it warm. He set the fractures in its foreleg with the same crude splinting that had saved his own arm and leg. And slowly, the way trust builds on a planet where every other living thing wants to eat you, it stopped flinching. It never fully learned his language, and he never fully learned its clicking, layered speech, but they built something between them anyway. A shared vocabulary of gestures and grunts, and eventually of work, because it turned out the scout had an engineer's mind too, in its own alien way, and 4 hands working a problem solved it faster than 2. A debt in blood. Trust, he learned over that first winter with the scout, was not a conversation. It was a series of small, repeated proofs, the kind neither of them had the language to discuss directly. He proved it the night the scout's fever spiked from the leg wound going bad, 3 weeks after he'd dug it out from under the rock slide, when every instinct the creature had left told it to crawl away from the human and die somewhere private, the way wounded things on this planet generally did. He didn't let it. He held it down through the worst of the fever, cooled it with rags soaked in the last of his clean water, forced foul-tasting broth down its throat when it was too weak to refuse, and stayed awake 3 full nights doing it. Because a fever in a creature he barely understood the physiology of was not something he trusted himself to sleep through. The scout proved it back, in its own way, the following spring, when a pack of the local flying predators found Vance's forge site while he was mid-repair on the atmospheric processor, both hands full, no weapon within reach. The scout put itself between him and the pack without hesitation, took 2 shallow slashes across its own flank doing it, and did not retreat until Vance had a torch lit and the pack had scattered into the dusk. Neither of them ever spoke about either night again. They didn't need to. By the time the second winter came, they worked in a rhythm 2 creatures from opposite ends of the galaxy had no business sharing, Vance handling the heavy fabrication, the scout's quicker hands and better night vision handling the fine work neither of them could do alone. And somewhere in that rhythm, without either of them deciding to, they'd stopped being 2 survivors sharing a shelter out of necessity and become something closer to a crew. The bow of the Vekthari. The moment that mattered came in the 5th winter, when a pack of the big burrowing predators, the same species whose tunnel had broken his leg, finally worked out that the 2 strange creatures denning near the wreck were slower and weaker than they smelled, and came for both of them in the dead of night. Vance fought with fire, because fire was the one tool this planet's native life had never evolved an answer for, driving torches into the dark until the pack scattered, but not before one got close enough to rake claws across the scout's flank, a wound that would have killed it without immediate care. He carried it inside. He cauterized the wound himself with a heated strut, while it screamed in a register he felt more than heard, and he held it down through the pain. Because the alternative was letting it bleed out in front of him. When it was over, when the shaking had stopped and the wound was closed, and the 2 of them sat in the dim heat of the shelter he'd built with his own broken hands, the scout did something it had never done in 5 years of wary cohabitation. It lowered its head, fully, exposing the unarmored underside of its throat, the single most vulnerable point on its entire body, the place any predator on this planet would go for first, and held perfectly still in front of him. A creature that had every biological reason never to trust a human, doing the one thing its instincts screamed against. He didn't know the gesture's full meaning, not then. He'd learn later that among the Vekthari, showing the throat to another being was not surrender. It was closer to an oath. This one is not prey. This one is kin. He put a hand, gently, on the scout's shoulder, and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying, and outside the wind kept trying, uselessly, to kill them both. 6 years in the wreck. Time did the thing time does on a world without a calendar. It blurred. Vance stopped counting days somewhere in the 3rd year and started counting winters instead, because winters were the only season that demanded anything of him. By the 6th, the shelter had become something closer to a settlement. A forge, a smokehouse, a water system, a cleared perimeter with warning trips rigged from old cable. All of it built and rebuilt and improved across years of trial, failure, and the particular patience of a man with nowhere to be and no one coming to check his work. He and the scout, he'd taken to calling it Vec for lack of anything better, and it had taken, in turn, to answering to a low clicking sound he was fairly sure was its attempt at his own name. Had mapped 40 kilometers of the surrounding terrain between them, knew the migration patterns of 6 major species, knew which plants would kill you slowly and which would kill you fast, and which, against all odds, were actually edible. He had scars over most of his body, a leg that ached before every storm, an arm that had healed a few degrees off true, and a beard he trimmed with a knife because vanity, it turned out, was one of the last things to die in a man, not the first. He also had, though he'd have laughed at the word if anyone had used it to his face, a kind of authority. Not command, not rank, just the quiet, earned certainty of a man who had solved every problem this planet had thrown at him for 6 straight years, and who no longer needed anyone's permission to be right. He thought about the princess sometimes, in the long dark of the worst nights. Not with anger. By the 6th year, anger takes energy he'd learned to spend more carefully than that. Just a flat, factual memory. She left me here. It was the correct call, tactically. It was still the thing that had happened. He wondered, sometimes, what she'd think of the man he'd become, and then caught himself wondering it and felt faintly ridiculous, because the woman who'd once looked at him like furniture had no particular reason to think of him at all. He was not waiting for her. He told himself that often enough that it had mostly stopped feeling like a lie. But some nights, watching the strange, unfamiliar stars wheel overhead through a gap in his shelter's roof, he let himself wonder anyway, the way a man alone for years will let himself wonder about anything at all, just to remember what wanting something used to feel like. The language of silence. Somewhere around the 5th year, Vance noticed he had stopped narrating his own work under his breath, a habit he'd carried since his first day as an apprentice engineer, back when talking a problem through out loud had felt like the only way to think clearly. He didn't need it anymore. He and the scout worked in a silence so complete that visitors, had there been any, might have mistaken it for 2 creatures who couldn't stand each other, when in fact it was the opposite. The silence of 2 minds that had stopped needing words to coordinate a repair. He thought, in the rare idle hours winter gave him, about what he'd become. He was leaner than he'd ever been in Dominion's service. All the softness the fleet's rations had left on him long since burned away by 6 years of labor and hunger and cold. His hands had changed too, the calluses gone thick and permanent, one whole knuckle on his right hand fused slightly crooked from a break that had healed without ever being properly set. He caught his own reflection sometimes in polished hull plating, and didn't entirely recognize the man looking back, not younger or older. Exactly, just harder, in the specific way that iron gets harder when you fold it under a hammer often enough. He did not think of himself as a hero. Heroes, in his experience, were men who got a choice about it. He had simply refused, every single day for 6 years, be the thing this planet wanted him to become, which was a corpse, or worse, a cautionary story told to other stranded crews about what happens when you stop trying. That refusal had cost him an arm that ached before every storm, a leg that never sat quite right, and a face full of scars he'd stopped bothering to catalog. It had also, somewhere along the way, without his noticing the exact moment it happened, made him into someone the planet itself seemed to have quietly, grudgingly, decided to stop trying to kill. Smoke on the horizon. The salvage crew that found him was not looking for him at all. They were picking through the old debris field for anything with resale value. 6 years after the Dominion had written the whole engagement off as a loss, and what they found instead, cresting the ridge above the crash site with a red carapaced alien walking calmly beside him like an old friend, was a man in stitched-together survival gear who looked less like a rescued castaway and more like something the planet itself had decided to grow. The crew's medic tried to examine him and got, for her trouble, a very calm, very firm refusal. He'd set his own bones for 6 years, he informed her, and he'd rather she just tell him which of the old injuries looked infected instead of poking at all of them. She found 4 that did. He let her treat those and nothing else. Vec would not board the salvage ship at first, some deep animal wariness of enclosed metal spaces winning out over years of trust, until Vance simply sat down at the base of the ramp and waited, unhurried, the way he'd learned to wait for everything on that planet, until the scout finally, grudgingly, followed him aboard. The crew wanted his story. He gave them the short version, crash, survival, a long walk home, and kept the rest to himself, because some things don't compress well into small talk, and because he'd already noticed, in the crew's hushed asides and sideways looks, that word of a man who'd survived 6 years alone on a registered Deathworld was going to travel a lot faster than he did. He was right. By the time the salvage ship reached Dominion space, the story had grown 3 new endings and a body count that wasn't his. He let people believe whatever version they wanted. He was mostly interested in a proper meal and a bed that didn't have his own handprints all over it. The empire he returns to. The Kaldreth Dominion he came back to was not the one he'd left. Princess Ilyra's father, the old sovereign, had died in the 2nd year of Vance's absence, and Ilyra herself had ascended to a throne that her uncle, Lord Regent Dreth, had been administering and quietly hollowing out, ever since, on the grounds that a princess still building her military record was in no position to rule alone. Vance heard all of this in fragments, from dockworkers and shipping manifests, and the kind of low gossip that always finds a man who looks like he has nowhere urgent to be. He also heard, in those same fragments, something more specific and more useful to a man with an engineer's habit of noticing when numbers didn't add up. The Sunspire Citadel, the ancestral seat of the Kaldreth throne, had undergone extensive renovations under the Regent's authority. Renovations that touched, among other things, the palace's primary thermal core, the massive geothermal exchange system that kept the entire mountain-set citadel livable in a climate that would otherwise cook its inhabitants alive. Vance had spent 6 years learning exactly one language fluently, the language of systems that keep people alive on worlds that want them dead. He knew, the way he knew his own crooked leg, that you did not quietly renovate a load-bearing thermal system unless you wanted either better efficiency or a very specific kind of catastrophic failure that looked like an accident. He didn't have proof. He didn't have rank or clearance or anything but a scarred body and 6 years of ferocious, patient stubbornness. What he had, when he thought about it, was a set of tools nobody had thought to take away from him, and a mechanic's instinct that had never once, in his whole life, been wrong about a system on the verge of failing. He spent his first week back in Dominion space doing the unglamorous work of simply learning how to be a person again. He slept in a real bed and woke up disoriented by the silence, the total absence of wind trying to find its way through a seam in the wall. He ate food that hadn't required him to outlast an animal first, and found, to his own quiet embarrassment, that his stomach couldn't handle rich meals anymore without protest, 6 years of scarcity having rewritten what his body considered normal. He caught himself, twice, reaching for tools that weren't there out of pure habit, hands wanting work the way a smoker's hands want a cigarette. Vec adjusted worse than he did. The scout spent the first several days refusing to leave whatever small space it had claimed as its den within the salvage crew's quarters, flinching at the artificial hum of climate control, at doors that opened on their own, at the sheer, overwhelming number of people crammed into spaces this small. Vance spent those days sitting near it, saying nothing, the same patient nothing he'd offered it 6 years earlier over a dying fire, until the flinching slowed and the scout, cautiously, began to explore a little further each day. It was Sarai, actually. Though he didn't know her name yet, not this early, a low-ranking clerk in the Citadel's public records office, who first put the pieces together for him without meaning to. He'd gone in to file the tedious paperwork his rescue required. Proof of identity, proof of prior service, the bureaucratic residue every government insists on even for a man who'd spent 6 years fighting a planet for his life. And while he waited, he listened to 2 clerks complain. In the particular unguarded way people complain when they've stopped noticing who's in the room with them, about the endless renovation permits the Regent's office kept filing for the Sunspire's lower levels. 3rd revision to the thermal exchange specifications this year, one of them muttered, stamping a form with more force than it needed. No sovereign's ever touched that system twice in a reign, let alone a regent who isn't even the sovereign. Vance said nothing at the time. He simply filed it away, the way he filed away every piece of information that didn't quite add up, and went looking later for the actual permits themselves, because permits, unlike gossip, came with schematics attached, and schematics were a language he trusted considerably more than rumor. Words with the Regent. He saw Lord Regent Dreth exactly once before the coronation, from a dockside crowd gathered to watch the old sovereign's brother make a public procession through the lower city. And it was enough to confirm everything the shipping manifests and the dockworkers' gossip had already told him. Dreth was built like every Caldreth Vance had ever known, tall and dense and armored in a way that made ordinary movement look like restrained violence. But there was something in the set of his jaw, a looseness around the eyes, that read as a man who had grown comfortable holding power he did not, technically, own. He stopped his procession to address the crowd, and his voice carried the same flat, clipped formality as every Caldreth Vance had ever heard, no contractions, no warmth, just precise and cold. The princess returns from the border campaigns a soldier, Dreth said, to a crowd that murmured its approval on cue. She is not yet returned as a sovereign. A throne requires patience these frail border conflicts do not teach. I have administered the dominion capably in her absence, and I will continue to do so, for as long as the realm requires steady hands rather than young ambition. It was, Vance thought, listening from the back of the crowd in clothes still smelling faintly of Kharun's cold, exactly the speech of a man building public consent for a delay that was never going to end on its own. He had heard versions of that speech before, in miniature, from officers who wanted to keep control of decisions that were never rightfully theirs, and every time, without exception, the delay had needed removing by force before it removed something more permanent. He did not introduce himself. He did not need to be seen yet. He simply watched Dreth's honor guard, noted which of them wore the maintenance division insignia that marked them as having clearance below the public levels, and started, quietly, planning the route he would need to disappear down once the time came. A throne room built wrong. He got into the Citadel the way he got into everything now, not through any door marked for him, but through the maintenance access nobody guards, because nobody imagines a threat would bother learning where it was. 6 years of reading one planet's infrastructure like a second language had left him fluent in the universal grammar of infrastructure everywhere. A coolant conduit was a coolant conduit, whether it ran through a wrecked transport or a mountain palace, and every conduit everywhere had a maintenance shaft running alongside it that some architect, somewhere, had been legally required to include. Vec came with him. The scout had refused, flatly, to be left behind twice in one lifetime, and 6 years of shared scars had taught Vance not to argue with that particular refusal. What he found in the lower thermal levels made his stomach drop in a way 6 years of physical danger never quite had. The primary exchange valve, the single largest safety mechanism standing between the Citadel's population and a geothermal blowout, had been quietly rerouted around its own failsafe, the physical override disconnected and replaced with a control line that ran, when he traced it hand over hand through the dark, directly to a private terminal in the Regent's personal quarters. It wasn't sabotage yet. It was a loaded weapon with the safety filed off, waiting for someone to decide the moment was right. A coronation, perhaps, with the princess and half the court gathered in the Sunspire's great hall directly above the exchange chamber, when a catastrophic accident would solve the Regent's succession problem rather more permanently than politics ever could. Vance sat back on his heels in the dark, 20 meters below a throne room he had absolutely no legal right to be near, and did the only thing that had ever made sense to him in 6 years of impossible situations. He started figuring out how to fix it. The guard captain's warning. On the second night, a guard found him. Not one of Dreth's honor guard, just a young Kaldreth watch captain doing a routine sweep of the lower levels, the kind of duty junior officers pulled when nobody senior wanted it. She came around a coolant junction with a hand already on her sidearm and found a filthy, scarred human crouched over an open access panel with tools spread across the floor like a surgeon's tray. And to her enormous credit, she did not simply open fire on instinct. "You are not authorized personnel," she said, flat and formal, the words coming out clipped the way her whole species delivered bad news. "State your business in the lower thermal levels or I will detain you." "Fair," Vance said, not looking up from the wiring he was splicing. "Short version, your regents had this exchange valve rigged to blow superheated steam straight up into the coronation hall. I'm building a second failsafe he doesn't know about. If you shoot me right now, there's a fair chance nobody finishes it in time, and a few hundred people upstairs have a very bad morning." She stared at him the way her whole species stared at things they hadn't decided whether to believe yet, weapons still half raised. "You expect me to accept the word of an unauthorized human found sabotaging Citadel infrastructure. I expect you to trace that control line yourself," he said, finally looking up at her, steady, unhurried, a man who had long since run out of patience for being doubted by people who hadn't done the work themselves. "It runs from this valve straight to a terminal in the Regent's private quarters. That's not something I rigged. That's something I found. Go look. I'll still be here when you get back because I'm not finished and I'm not leaving until I am." She left. He kept working, hands steady despite the very real chance she'd return with a full detachment and end this before it started. Because stopping to worry about that outcome wouldn't change whether it happened, and worry, he'd learned a long time ago on a much colder planet than this one, was a luxury that solved nothing. She came back 40 minutes later, alone, her face, as much of it as her species' features let him read, considerably paler than before. She didn't apologize. Her people didn't, as a rule. She simply knelt beside his tools, picked up a length of the scavenged wire he'd been working with, and said, "Tell me what you require. I will not report this until it is finished." It was, Vance thought, watching her hands move with a quick, practical competence that told him she'd worked with her own hands before politics. The first time in 6 years he'd had genuine help on a repair, and he found he'd almost forgotten what that felt like. The valve at the heart of the palace. He had 4 days before the coronation, by the numbers on a public notice board he'd read on his way in. 4 days to solve a problem that would normally take a licensed thermal engineer and a full shutdown crew a month, using a mechanic's toolkit he'd assembled from a mountain palace's forgotten storage lockers and a Vekthari scout who understood pressure systems better than any Dominion citizen ever gave his species credit for. The core problem was elegant, in the ugly way sabotage often is. The exchange valve's failsafe had been physically disconnected, but the control terminal in the Regent's quarters could trigger a full-bore release of superheated geothermal pressure directly upward through the ventilation risers that fed the Great Hall. Not an explosion. Nothing so crude as that. Just a wall of steam and heat that would, in the enclosed hall, kill everyone in it within 90 seconds and leave behind exactly the kind of ambiguous tragedy that history books call an accident. Vance couldn't simply reconnect the failsafe. The Regent's people checked the lower levels daily, and any obvious repair would be found and reversed before the coronation. What he could do, what 6 years on a Deathworld had trained him, better than any engineering academy ever could, to do with broken systems and no proper parts, was build a second, hidden failsafe the Regent didn't know to look for, tucked behind an access panel that had been welded shut since before either sovereign was born, tied not to the obvious control line, but to a thermal sensor Vance rigged from scavenged palace wiring, and absurdly, a fragment of hull plating he'd carried off Kharun without ever quite knowing why. The physics of it were simple enough to explain to anyone who'd ever boiled water under pressure, even if building it had been anything but a geothermal exchange system like the Sunspires worked by bleeding heat from the mountain's core through a network of pressure-regulated channels. cooling the surge in stages before it ever reached the surface levels people actually lived in. Skip those stages, dump the surge straight up an unregulated riser, and you got exactly what Dreth wanted: an instantaneous wall of superheated steam with nowhere to expand except into whatever room sat at the top of the shaft. Vance's rigged sensor didn't try to stop the surge itself. Stopping several tons of pressurized steam outright would have required infrastructure he simply didn't have 4 days and a scavenger's toolkit to build. Instead, it exploited the one variable Dreth's sabotage hadn't accounted for: a secondary runoff shaft, sealed and forgotten decades ago, that still connected to the same pressure network at a lower junction. Trip the sensor at the correct threshold, and a valve no larger than a dinner plate would swing open just long enough to give the surge an easier path than the one Dreth had built for it, the same way water always finds the lowest ground first, whatever obstacles sit in its way. It would only work once. It would only work if the timing was exact, the sensor sensitive enough to trigger before the surge reached the risers, but not so sensitive that ordinary system fluctuations tripped it early and gave the whole scheme away. He tested it, as best he could without triggering the real event, 11 separate times over 4 sleepless days, adjusting the sensor's threshold by increments so small Sarai, once she joined him, had to read the calibration off a gauge he could no longer focus his own tired eyes on clearly. If the valve opened without the pressure being bled off first through the correct secondary channel, his rigged sensor would trigger a mechanical vent that dumped the surge into an old, disused runoff shaft instead of the risers above the hull. It would not stop the sabotage. It would redirect the entire, catastrophic weight of it somewhere empty. It took him 4 days, 2 burns, 1 screaming argument in gestures and clicks with Vec about whether a particular joint would hold under pressure. Vec was right, as it turned out, and Vance rebuilt it a 3rd time and roughly no sleep at all. On the morning of the coronation, he sat in the dark beneath the throne room, filthy, exhausted, and reasonably confident that he had just built the only thing standing between several hundred people and a very quiet massacre. What the cold teaches. The Regent moved early. Vance felt it before he understood it, a change in the ambient hum of the pipework around him, a pressure shift in his ears that 6 years of listening to a planet's worth of systems had trained him to recognize instantly: the specific wrongness of a valve opening that should have stayed shut. Somewhere above him, in a hall full of nobility and a princess in ceremonial armor about to accept a crown, the trap had been sprung. He didn't run for the exits. Running had never once solved a problem on Kharun, and it wasn't going to solve one here. He ran toward the rigged panel instead, Vec at his heels, and threw himself against the manual release he'd built into his own sabotage of a sabotage, a lever assembly crude enough that a child could have operated it, if the child weren't fighting superheated steam already venting through a seal Vance's hasty welding hadn't fully sealed. The heat hit him first, a wall of it rolling up through the shaft that fogged his vision and stole the breath straight out of his lungs before he'd even reached the panel. And the sound was worse. A deep, tearing roar of pressurized vapor forcing its way through a channel never designed to carry it, loud enough that he felt it in his sternum more than he heard it in his ears. The burn across his forearm was immediate and vicious, steam finding the old scar tissue from 6 years back like it remembered the way. Blistering skin he'd once nearly lost to frostbite and had somehow, absurdly, kept whole through everything Kharun had thrown at him. He held the lever anyway, both hands now, weight thrown against it, teeth locked so hard together his jaw ached for days afterward, while Vec jammed a length of scavenged pipe into the mechanism's opposite side to keep it from slipping back, the scout's own claws smoking faintly where superheated metal met exposed carapace. Above them, muffled through meters of stone and metal, he could hear nothing, no screaming, no chaos, which meant, he prayed, that the risers above the hall had stayed dry, that the surge was finding his runoff shaft instead of several hundred throats. The pressure fought him for 11 seconds that felt considerably longer. Then, with a groan of metal settling into a channel it was never designed for, the surge diverted, howling away into the old disused shaft in a column of steam that would, later, be visible from outside the mountain for exactly as long as it took to dissipate into the evening sky, mistaken, by everyone who saw it, for some ceremonial display marking the new sovereign's coronation. Vance let go of the lever, sat down hard on the wet stone floor, and looked at the burn already blistering across his arm with the flat, exhausted acceptance of a man who had, by now, made something of a career out of this exact feeling. "Over time," he said, to no one to veck to the pipes. "Somebody owes me so much overtime. What steam leaves behind?" The watch captain, her name, he learned in the chaos afterward, was Sarai, got him off the wet stone floor and into a proper medical bay before the burn on his arm could do more than it already had. And it was there, 40 minutes later, that the first ripples of what had happened upstairs started reaching down into the lower levels in the form of increasingly urgent, increasingly confused reports. No one in the coronation hall had died. No one had even fully understood what had almost happened to them, beyond a column of steam venting dramatically from an old runoff shaft in a display several nobles later swore, with great confidence, had been a deliberate and rather tasteful piece of ceremonial staging. Only a handful of people would ever know how close the truth had come to something considerably worse. And for the moment, in the chaos of a coronation gone strange, Vance and Sarai and the disused shaft below the palace were nobody's priority. That changed the moment Dreth's personal guard traced the same control line the watch captain had traced hours earlier, and found it disconnected, rerouted, defeated by an amateur's rig of scavenged wire and hull plating that any Dominion engineer would have recognized, on site, as impossible for an ordinary saboteur to have built without weeks of preparation and detailed schematics they should not have had access to. Dreth himself arrived in the medical bay within the hour, flanked by two of his own guard, and looked down at the burned, exhausted human on the cot with an expression of cold, careful calculation that Vance recognized instantly, because he'd worn a version of it himself, 6 years ago, staring down a coolant manifold that was about to get 400 people killed. "You have caused considerable inconvenience," Dreth said, each word measured, formal, giving away nothing. "I do not yet know who you are working for." "Nobody," Vance said. "I fix things that are broken. Yours was broken on purpose, which is a new one for me, but the fix works the same either way." He held up the burned arm, wrapped now in proper synthetic gauze instead of strips of his own shirt. "You're welcome, by the way. Nobody said that yet." Dreth's jaw tightened, the first genuinely human, or rather, genuinely readable, expression Vance had seen from him. "You are a maintenance technician. You have no standing to accuse a regent of the Dominion of anything." "I've got a control line that runs straight to your private quarters," Vance said, mild as ever, too tired for theater. "I've got a watch captain who traced it herself before I ever said a word to her, and I've got about 6 years of practice not caring very much what someone with a title thinks of me while I'm the one holding the wrench. So, your move, my lord." Dreth did not answer. He turned, instead, and left the medical bay at a pace just fast enough to look unhurried, and by the time his personal guard finished quietly, discreetly disappearing from their posts over the following 2 days, it was clear to everyone paying attention exactly which direction that particular conversation had ended up going. She came home to a ghost. Ilyra found him 3 hours later, not because anyone reported him, but because a Regent's Guard captain, questioned sharply enough about strange readings from the lower thermal levels, finally admitted there was a man down there, had been for days, apparently, filthy and scarred, and entirely unbothered by the Citadel's security, accompanied by an animal the guards couldn't identify, and were, for reasons they couldn't quite articulate, afraid to approach. She came down the maintenance shaft herself, still in half her ceremonial armor, and found him sitting against the disused runoff shaft with a burned arm wrapped in strips of his own shirt, a Vekthari scout curled protectively against his side, and an expression that suggested he'd been expecting her for roughly 6 years. She did not recognize him at first. Why would she? The mechanic she dismissed with a glance had been unremarkable in every way that mattered to a princess. This man had scars layered over scars, a beard he'd clearly cut with a knife, a leg that sat wrong when he stood, and eyes that had stopped, somewhere along the way, finding anything about her particularly intimidating. "You are the engineer," she said finally, and for the first time in her life, her flat, precise voice actually wavered just slightly on the last word. "From the transport, I ordered you left." "You did," he agreed. "Wasn't wrong, tactically, turned out fine anyway." He nodded at the runoff shaft, still ticking as it cooled. Your uncle rigged your thermal core to cook everyone in that hall today. I redirected it. Cost me a shirt and most of the skin on this arm. He held up the arm, the blistering already going an ugly, familiar color. Wouldn't mind someone taking a look at that, actually, if it's not too much trouble. Been a while since anyone but me set my own bones. She stared at him for a long moment. This scarred, limping, entirely unbothered man who had apparently spent 6 years learning to survive a planet that killed everything else on contact, then walked straight into her palace and quietly saved her life without waiting to be asked or thanked. And something in her flat gold eyes that had never, in Vance's memory, held anything but cold assessment, shifted into something considerably harder to name. Guards arrived behind her, weapons ready, uncertain what threat had prompted their sovereign to descend alone into the maintenance levels. Ilyra raised one hand, and they stopped instantly. "Lower your weapons," she said. "This man held my throne together with a length of scavenged pipe while I was upstairs accepting a crown he just finished protecting." She looked back down at him, at the exhausted, filthy, entirely unimpressed expression on his face, the expression of a man who had genuinely, sincerely, more urgent concerns right now than royal protocol, like the meal he clearly hadn't had in days and the burn steadily worsening on his arm. "What do you require?" she said. "Elias Vance." "Food," he said. "A cot, and somebody who isn't a 6-year-old memory of me to look at this arm before it decides to get creative on me the way the last one did." He paused, considering. "And somebody should probably arrest your uncle. Sooner's better." She almost smiled. It looked unfamiliar on her face, like a language she was relearning. "That," she said, "can be arranged." Behind her, in the ruined coronation hall above, the throne she'd been meant to formally claim that morning sat exactly where it always had. And later that evening, once the Regent had been taken into custody, and the guards had finished sweeping the lower levels for further sabotage, a filthy, bandaged mechanic with a Vekthari scout dozing at his feet was found, by 3 separate startled officials, sitting on the very edge of that throne while he waited for someone to bring him the meal he'd asked for. Because as far as Elias Vance was concerned, he had, in point of fact, earned the seat. The weight of a crown. Ilyra found him there 20 minutes later, in the great hall itself this time, freshly out of her ceremonial armor and into something plainer, and stopped in the doorway at the sight of a scarred human eating cold ration bread on the steps of her throne, with a Vekthari scout using his good leg as a pillow. "That is not," she said, "customarily where guests sit." "Wasn't planning on staying," he said, around a mouthful of bread. "Chairs just closer to the kitchens than the floor is, and my legs had a long day." He nodded at the empty seat above him. "Also, respectfully, ma'am, somebody should probably check the structural welds on that thing before you actually sit in it during a real ceremony. Your uncle's people had access to more than just the thermal system. I haven't confirmed it's clean, but I wouldn't put money on it being untouched." She stared at him for a long moment, and this time, when the corner of her mouth moved, it wasn't a flicker she fought back down. "You have been in my palace for 4 days," she said. "You have uncovered an assassination plot, redirected a lethal pressure surge with your bare hands, and are now informing me that you do not trust the structural integrity of my own throne." "In my defense," he said, "your uncle's had 6 years to get creative, and I've had 6 years of assuming everything's rigged to fail until I've personally checked it. Habits hard to break. You could have simply told the guard captain and let trained engineers verify the throne," Ilyra said, though there was no real reproach in it, more the careful, curious tone of someone still working out the shape of a person she'd once dismissed in under a minute. "Could have," he agreed, "but then I wouldn't have known for certain, and not knowing for certain isn't a habit I've been able to afford in a long time." He set the last of the bread down and looked up at her, unhurried, entirely without the deference her rank usually commanded from everyone else in the room. "You left me on a Deathworld, Your Highness. Correct call at the time. I'm not sore about it, spent a long while being sore about it, honestly, and decided it wasn't worth the energy. But I'd like it on record that the next time somebody in your family tries to get you killed in your own home, you send word down to the maintenance deck first. We tend to notice things nobody else bothers looking for." She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, the flat formality that had always defined her voice had softened into something closer, if not to warmth, then at least to honesty. "I did not expect to find you again," she said. "I certainly did not expect to find you waiting on my throne." Wasn't waiting for you specifically, he said, and there was the faintest, dry curve to his mouth now too. Was waiting for someone to bring dinner. You just happened to walk in first. He paused. Though for what it's worth, glad it worked out this way instead of the other one. Vec, still curled against his leg, made a low, satisfied clicking sound that Vance had over 6 years, come to understand meant approximately the same thing a cat's purr meant, and settled deeper into sleep, entirely unbothered by royalty, coronations, or the several hundred years of protocol currently being quietly dismantled in a throne room that smelled faintly, still, of cooling steam. Ilyra Caldrath looked at the two of them, the scarred, limping engineer who had refused, for 6 impossible years, to stop functioning, and the alien scout who trusted him with its life, and decided, with the same flat certainty she brought to every decision that mattered, that whatever title this man ended up carrying in her court, engineer was going to remain, permanently, wholly inadequate to describe him. There will be a position for you here, she said. Whatever rank you require, name it. Chief Engineer, Vance said, without hesitation. Full authority to reject any renovation permit I don't personally sign off on first. He glanced at the throne above him, then back at her. And somebody else's turn to fix the next thing that breaks around here. I've put in my 6 years. She almost laughed. It looked on her like something she was still relearning how to do properly, and it suited her better than she seemed to realize. A debt repaid twice over. Sarai visited him twice more before he was released from the medical bay. The second time bringing with her 3 other watch officers who had, by then, heard enough of the real story through whatever channels palace gossip traveled to want to see the human responsible for themselves. They did not bow, exactly. Caldrath custom did not extend that gesture to foreigners, let alone unranked ones, but they stood a little straighter in his presence than strict protocol required. And one of them, an older officer with scarring of her own along one shoulder plate, set a small ration bar on his bedside table without a word, the closest thing to a gift her species formality allowed between near strangers. You could have let me arrest you and sorted out the truth later, Sarai said, on that second visit, watching him flex his bandaged arm with the flat scrutiny of someone still deciding how much of this man's competence was luck and how much was simply who he was. It would have been the safer choice from where you stood. Wasn't looking for safe, Vance said, looking for the hall not to fill with steam. Safe was somewhere down the list. She considered that for a moment, in the unhurried way her whole species seemed to consider everything, and then said, with the particular bluntness Vance had come to recognize as the highest compliment a Caldrath generally offered, "You are not what I expected, from a species we are taught tires walking up an incline." "Yeah," Vance said, closing his eyes against the dull throb still radiating up from his arm. "Get that a lot. If you made it this far, drop a comment telling me which beat you'd have broken under first. The cold, the hunger, or the 6 years of nobody coming back for you. And if this one hit, go ahead and like it and subscribe, because there's more where Elias came from, and somewhere out there, another Deathworld is waiting to underestimate somebody."